Good evening. Welcome. Thank you everyone for your attendance. To begin the evening, I'd like to welcome the Principal of Hillside Christian College, Stephen Lamont, to the microphone. Can you please welcome him?
Well, good evening, everyone. You found your way here through all the bush, obviously, and the darkness out there. But thank you for coming out tonight, which is a really important occasion. My job is to simply just to welcome you. I'm not going to welcome every dignitary. I'll leave that to Laurel to do because she's had some format. I'd like to acknowledge particularly our parents of the school who've come tonight and also our students who have come tonight as well, for some of them as well. So well done, kids. Excellent. So yeah, please feel most welcome here. What you can see is what you get here around the school. It's pretty much just full of kids. That's the only difference on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, so my background, I came here 16 years ago. And I came as a relief teacher. So I was working for the government for 20 years before that, and now I'm very, very pleased to be in Christian education, which is why I'm personally so passionate about what we do in Christian schools. Faith is at the core of everything we do. A bit of background, we have 470 students here at the school. We're not a massive school, but it's just how we like it, actually. So, and we have brilliant children. And while we have nice grounds and nice trees and all that, it's all well and good and nice and it's all lovely. But when it boils down to it, it's the children that are the great asset of the school. And I would add the parents, but I don't tell them that. But and our staff are passionate about working in Christian schools. They choose to work here. That's what they want. So I guess tonight my input would be just quite simply the word choice and retaining that choice and making sure we're passionate about it. For us, we're an intentional Christian school. We build our whole foundation on Christ and his teachings. And that's how we started. So we're trying to stay faithful to our vision. But tonight, is it not about our school particularly? It's about Christian schools generally, or schools of faith. You could even say it extends beyond perhaps the Christian faith as well as schools to operate in a private manner or in an independent manner. So it doesn't just involve us, and it's a much bigger picture than that. So I think with every election, but it's not just election, it's policy. It's very important. Policies actually affect things. They actually affect the reality. They affect the children, affect the families, affect staff. So I'd commend tonight to you. I'd say it's great that you're active, that you're actually coming out, you're actually coming and go, you're actually interested. I think that's a commendable thing. And thank you so much to the politicians as well, because they are unsung heroes. They take a lot of flack, but they do an incredibly important job. And yeah, so I'd just like to acknowledge their work tonight and coming out tonight from that as well. So sit back, relax, hopefully, enjoy the questions. And yeah, if you need to know anything about school, feel free to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, these forums provide a space for candidates to engage with their electorate, hear concerns, and share their party's policies. These events for us are not about endorsing any particular party, but about giving candidates a platform to express their position on key issues, allowing you, our audience, to make an informed voting decision based on what matters to you most. For all of our forums, invitations were sent out to all of the major parties. And for tonight's event, we were pleased to secure our candidates who are on stage and other members of their parties who are in the audience, who will be introduced later on. For tonight, let me formally welcome Honourable Nick Gorian, MLC Shadow Attorney General and Shadow Minister for Child Protection. Senator Matt O'Sullivan, Liberal. George Tilbury, Liberal for Forestfield. Marika Gronwald, Australian Christian Legislative Council. And Shimmer Timoney, Australian Christians for Kalamunda. Can we welcome them? This evening's candidates will have the chance to respond to 6 preset questions. The questions will be on the PowerPoint for audiences members to view. We are also using an app called Slido to manage questions from the audience. At any time of the night, as you think of a question, you can go to slido.com and type in the number on the screen and submit your questions. The questions will be moderated by Dr. Brendan Long, my colleague from Canberra, and the number of questions that we have at the end of the evening will be time dependent. If you don't have a mobile phone or Slido, you will also be able to contribute questions from the audience directly. Right. The first question. What is your position on religious discrimination? Would you support positive rights to religious freedom being legislated in the state and Commonwealth law?
Thanks, Laurel. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you for the invitation. And at the outset, before I answer the first question, can I acknowledge George Tilbury, our candidate for Forestfield. If you're living in and around Forestfield and you want to talk to George, feel free to do so afterwards. And also Adam Hort, who's here in the back row there. He's our candidate for Kalamunda. So if you're in and around that area, have a chat to Adam afterwards. Also, before I answer the first question, I want to acknowledge my federal colleague, Senator Matt O'Sullivan, because this particular issue does straddle both state and federal jurisdictions. And so I really appreciate Matt taking the time to be here this evening. And can I also quickly acknowledge Marika Grunwald, who's here on behalf of the Australian Christians and her team of candidates. Laurel, in response to the first question, in terms of whether the Parliamentary Liberal Party would support enshrining positive rights, I simply make this point in my capacity as Shadow Attorney General on behalf of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. We are open to having a conversation with Christian Schools Australia, Freedom for Faith and any other organisation about enshrining positive rights. However, what we would say is that we're not currently convinced that there's a problem with the existing system. The problem and the threat exists because there are governments of certain persuasions who insist on trying to remove the existing exemptions that apply for faith-based schools and faith-based organisations. The position of the Parliamentary Liberal Party is that we don't support the removal of those exemptions. We certainly won't be removing them, but we are open to having a conversation about the enshrining of positive rights. But we would ask those organisations to put a specific proposal to us, because as I say, we think that the status quo is satisfactory. The real danger is whether the status quo gets disturbed. And we know in their absence that the Cook Labor government have publicly announced that they do intend to change the Equal Opportunity Act in Western Australia, and that's something we don't support.
Well, thank you very much, Laurel, and thank you, Brendan, for the invitation, and Stephen, for your warm welcome to this lovely school. I'm also the Shadow Assistant Education Minister now. I was just recently appointed by Peter Dutton in the last few weeks, and so one of the things that I have actually been charged with is to make sure that our independent and non-government school sector is protected and that it is able to function as it has done, and it's able to receive the full funding that it has been receiving. And I'll always urge us to do even more if I can. But it's terrific to be here. And to answer the question, to add to what Nick, my good friend, has said, the same scenario applies federally. What we did see was a commission by the Attorney General to look at, for the Australian Law Reform Commission, to look at the Sex Discrimination Act and to see if it needed to be amended and to make recommendations in relation to a religious discrimination bill. And the terms of reference were set in a way that the Law Reform Commission was left, according to the words of the Chief Justice Rothman, left to no other position but to recommend the repeal of Section 38 out of the Sex Discrimination Act, which is the protection that schools have to be able to hire staff on the basis of their own values and their own ethos, and to make that decision and to have that exemption. And the recommendation from the Law Reform Commission was to completely remove that section without providing any guardrail of protection by way of a religious discrimination bill. Now, the government quite conveniently said that this was a report to the government and not from the government, and saying that this is just what has been recommended to them. But the reality is, the Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash was provided with a draft of the bill that the government was bringing forward. And sadly, it actually was a carbon copy, a direct lift from the recommendations of the Australian Law Reform Commission. And it was going to implement exactly what it recommended, which was to repeal Section 38 and the RDA, the Religious Discrimination Act that it was proposing, provided no protection whatsoever. So the problem is, in answering the question, the problem is we have to deal with what is possible in politics. And while, personally, as a person of faith myself, Christian, got a Nations Church in Myrie, my wife and I, and used to be a youth pastor many, many years ago. Of course, as Christians, we would like to see greater protections and those things enshrined, but we have to deal with what is possible. And the Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash has said the Liberal Party's position is that we will only work to advance protections and not do anything that would actually set back those protections. And with the Senate the way that it is, with the balance of power in the way that it is, we simply could not risk putting forward law into the Parliament that would actually have people of faith, no matter what faith that might be, take a step back. And so, as Nick was saying, the law exists already. Schools are protected in particular and already, and we want to make sure that that is maintained and that we don't do anything that would actually put that in jeopardy. Thank you.
Thank you guys for your responses. Look, we're Australian Christians, so this is not my first rodeo going through this religious discrimination gauntlet. It's been an ongoing issue pretty much since 2019, I believe. But even when you go beyond that, we have to appreciate that one piece of legislation affects another. So all of this conversation around religious freedom and expression really started when we amended the Marriage Act back in 2017. So voting down key amendments there had a pretty significant effect, not only on consequent religious discrimination bills, but of course that's now emboldened all the states to look at changing their sex discrimination acts. So as a party, we are and have been fairly consistent in this fight, very mindful also of small tweaks in the Sex Discrimination Acts, the Equal Opportunity Act, but this is something across the board that will never change. Absolutely supportive of Christian schools, absolutely supportive of religious expression, and of course realising that religious freedom is more than just saying I'm a Christian. So that comes with being able to worship, being able to have schools that share our ethos, being able to employ staff that share our ethos. So really important, really crucial, 100% solid commitment on supporting this state and federal. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, our second question. Parents make a choice and a financial commitment when they send their children to a faith-based school. Should faith-based schools be able to legally require all staff to act in accordance with the faith of their school as a condition of their employment?
Thanks, Laurel. They can at the moment, and that shouldn't change. And although there is a continuing attack on faith-based schools by certain political parties, both large and small, this absolutely should not change, as I said earlier. And the simple example that I often give when explaining to other parliamentarians why this is so important is I bring it back to the home front. Imagine for a moment that a husband and wife, it might be a Friday evening, and they would like to go out for a meal together, and they've got young children at home. No fair-minded Western Australian or no fair-minded Australian would begrudge that couple being able to choose who is going to look after their children for those couple of hours while they go out. They would want to choose carefully who's looking after their children because of safety concerns, but they also want to be very careful about the choice of that person in terms of their values, the way that they live, and the way in which they might influence their young children. Now, if we hold that to be a fair thing to, inverted commas, discriminate for that couple for those 2 hours, how much more so would it be appropriate for a parent to be able to choose to, inverted commas, discriminate who is looking after their children, not for 2 hours, but for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 40 weeks of the year, for 12 or 14 years of their life. So it is evidently the case and that this particular freedom to be able to choose who is educating your child should never change, and we're certainly committed to that.
Changing it up. Tag team. Okay. Great. One thing I do want to mention is it's not a matter of should, but must. And so, again, when we look at Article 18, that talks about the fact that Australia has signed up to the International Political Covenant on Rights, Civil Rights, teaching and being able to send your kids to a school that adhere to your ethos is an important thing. So that has to be protected. It should be protected. It must be protected because we signed up and said we agree with that. Of course, the troubling thing is you do have a lot of lobbyists, you do have a lot of groups that are constantly pushing, and I guess this is actually an encouragement even for Christians and conservatives to go, look, we've created this vacuum where other people have been allowed to fill this space, especially talking about religious freedom and expression. We actually have to get a bit gutsier and we have to get a bit bolder as well to say, well, hang on, this is not about schools having the right to discriminate, but there are some very basic things that school need to be able to teach according to their ethos. Now, I wanted to share this, and this is the reason I brought in my notes, but the irony at the moment is you've got the Australian Law Reform Commission report, the last one, and the title was Maximising the Realisation of Human Rights. But of course, that's everybody's rights, it seems, but except for Christian schools. So I think even being really mindful of what's happening at a state level with not only, the Law Reform Commission, but even the Equal Opportunity Acts and what they're doing to undermine language. And of course, the main thing is this push towards, gender neutral language and forcing schools how they employ. So I think, yes, parents absolutely should have the right, but more than that, they must have the right because we're actually have signed up and are under these international covenants. And that's a reminder for a lot of these politicians as well.
If it's good enough for a political party to be able to hire people and engage people that adhere to their own values, then I think it's good enough for schools. I mean, it would be quite remarkable, wouldn't it, if someone said that, well, the Liberal Party couldn't say that, sorry, you can't go out and campaign on behalf of the Labor Party. I mean, that would be absurd, of course, to have that sort of standard. And so to change it for schools would be completely wrong. Schools should be able to continue to hire the staff that adhere to their values. I just want to share a story with you. I went to Providence, so it was then called Thornley Christian College, went right through high school there. And one of the arguments that's made on this point is that, well, sure, the religious education teacher needs to be a person of that particular faith, but why should the person at the reception desk or the gardener or the bus driver or the phys ed teacher need to be adhering to that particular faith? Well, in my school, and I'm sure it's the experience here, Stephen, the environment that you create, the culture that you create is very important, and it doesn't matter what role a member of the staff has. And I remember quite distinctly in year 10, myself and a bunch of other boys, we started to muck up a bit, and a few of us were getting involved in things that were not right, and there was drugs getting involved, and not me, thankfully, didn't go down that track, but probably was heading that way. And it was the phys ed teacher, Mr. Holtz, and it was the bus driver, Mr. Vasquez, and a bunch of other teachers that took us away on a school camp. And we did caving during the day, we did abseiling, we did surfing, and all these sort of things. But then at night, they gathered us around a fire and spoke into our lives as Christians. They imparted into our lives and got us back onto the straight and narrow. And so they weren't the religious education teacher. They all embodied that. And that was an important factor. And I know that, Stephen, I'm sure it's the same here. That is a feature of a school, and that school community needs to be able to be preserved and needs to be able to be fostered so that you can continue in those sort of, along those tracks.
Some states and the ACT have legislated to criminalise conversion practices on sexuality and gender issues. If WA was to follow suit, what protections would you support to allow all faith-based communities to teach and live out their beliefs on sexuality and gender?
Narelle, there'd be two things I'd say in response to this question. First of all, let's not give up that legislation will pass. If WA was to follow suit, is how the question is introduced. Well, let's not let that happen. Let's not let that happen at first instance. The second thing that I would say in response to this question is that this debate that has happened across the nation, and it's been quite a thing in recent times to talk about so-called conversion therapy, it really depends ultimately, like any law, on how you define it. Now, again, every fair-minded Western Australian, I would say, ought to be concerned about any coercive practices. As a matter of principle, we don't support coercing another person in whatever the context might be. But that's very different to having a conversation, to have dialogue with another person, to be journeying with another person. I was very interested to hear what Matt just said in respect to his own personal lived experience as then a student at a school. It wasn't a case there, as you could hear, that the teachers were simply accommodating a particular pathway that those boys were seeming to be going down. No, there was a conversation that took place, and quite appropriately so. And that's no different to what might happen in the home. And I think the fundamental point that is missed by those who do not share our view on this is that they do not understand that the role of the teacher in this particular context is to stand in the place of the parents. They are there as the de facto parents for that period of time. And so, of course, it's entirely appropriate that they should be able to have the freedom to have the kind of conversations that parents would want to be having with their child, no matter what they might be wrestling with at that particular point in time. So I think that we cannot afford to go down the path we've seen in Victoria. What's happened there? There've been no end of headaches. Last thing we need is for that to be introduced here in Western Australia.
I completely agree with my friend Nick Duran, and of course this is primarily a state matter. But the additional point that I will make is, and when it comes to schools, is that if laws like this were enacted in Western Australia, one of the big things that will happen is that the costs of your insurance as a school community would go up, because with other laws that are now in place or working to be in place at a federal level, we have the cost protections bill, which means that the defendant will have to pay for the cost of the person that's bringing forward that action. So that means for a school, your costs will go up to fight off these sort of claims that are brought forward, which of course, in a cost of living crisis, why would you want to add additional costs and burden to schools and in turn the parents and the community of the school?
I think one of the practical things I remember as they were going through the Equal Opportunity Act and some of this legislation was actually getting parents to share feedback about, what is my school like? What is the environment like? And of course, they use these anomalies when they talk about conversion practices as if, someone's locking people in a room and bashing them and forcing them to be a certain way. And when we went through the research here in WA, this has not been an issue. The practice of conversion therapy hasn't been an issue at all. And in fact, a lot of those practices were state sanctioned back in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't limited to churches or faith-based organisations at all. So even when we consider that, when you talk about conversion legislation, as Nick was saying earlier, they always get you with the words, and it's so tricky when people go, oh, conversion therapy. Well, that's actually a myth in itself. So something to be very mindful of. Of course, the one thing that we face at the moment is if you can't reconceptualise or conceptualise gender or define it, you have an issue. So a big thing, of course, and sorry to be a clanging cymbal, but when in 2017, when you've reconceptualised marriage and you've reconceptualised gender terms, you're going to have a real issue with these pieces of legislation. So conversion therapy, a bit of a furphy. How do we protect it? Well, again, the sheer volume of submissions that we've had in responses to, again, preventing changes in the Equal Opportunity Act, preventing changes that actually limit schools. Groundswell, grassroots support and courage is always so necessary. And can I just say, I'm so sorry I forgot, but we've also got Jacob Morrow for Forestfield, our candidate. So sorry about that earlier. Give him a wave. And Dave Kingston for Bassendean, who's travelled a bit far. And I've got Joan Lee for Riverton, who's sitting in the back there. So thank you guys so much for coming along.
Feeling decidedly short every time I stand up. That's okay. God knew what he was doing. All right. Will you commit to supporting no reduction in current funding levels, state and Commonwealth, to independent schools so that parents are able to afford their choice of schooling?
We're mixing it up. Well, most of the funding from for independent schools actually does come from the federal government, and we are fully committed as a coalition to maintain that funding. And as I said earlier, I'll always be a champion to do whatever we can to even support more. But the reality is, it is at risk. I don't want to be a scaremonger here, but I've got to give you the reality. The Australian Greens Party have it in their platform. You can go on their website and see that they want to defund independent schools. It's a condition of their, they've made it a condition of their support for a minority government. And if you believe polls, and any politician that says here they don't look at polls, is not telling you the truth. The polls are saying that the most likely outcome of this coming federal election, whenever that may be, in a few weeks or a month or so, it's time, is that we're in for a minority government one way or the other. And if it's going to be a Labor minority government, then they'll be reliant on the Greens. And they certainly will be reliant on the Greens, if not in the House, then in the Senate, because there's 12 Green senators in the Senate, and they'll make it a condition of their support for any other legislation. So this is a big risk, and we need to make sure people realise that this is what is at risk at this upcoming election. We are, and Peter Dutton is very committed to ensuring that schools, independent schools, be they Christian, Jewish, Islamic and Catholic schools, are able to maintain the level of funding that they have been getting and seeing that increase. So thank you.
I guess, yeah, Matt was talking about balance. So whilst we don't have a party in our own right governing, I guess this is where a balance in the upper house, and of course, hopefully one day federal, is really, really important to make sure there's a critical mass of voices that are supporting this too. One really interesting thing that I was reading last week was actually the efficacy and the results that Christian private schools are having versus public schools. And my friend Daryl actually posted this a few days ago as well, that private schools are actually growing at a rate of 2.7%. And they're growing because parents are voting with their feet. So I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind as well, that if there were so many issues and people were not happy with it and funding is an issue, well, let's really have a look at the efficacy, the positive impacts that a lot of these schools are having versus public schools, which nationally growing at 0.3%. So, you know, even in that, there's a message not only for a lot of these out of touch parties and politicians, but hey, let's be very mindful that there's a reason people are voting and parents are voting with their feet at the moment.
As Matt says quite correctly, the majority of the funding that's provided to independent schools comes from the federal government, but there is a proportion that's provided at a state level as well. I've had a conversation with Libby Medham, the Liberal Party leader here in Western Australia, and she has confirmed there absolutely will be no reduction of the funding if we're to win government on the 8th of March. I might also add this point in conclusion to this question, that and you know, I'm careful about how I describe this out of fairness to my political opponent who's absent tonight, but I have had a conversation about this general issue with the current Attorney General from obviously the Cook Labor government. And the point that he makes is he says that faith-based schools, if they want to receive the funding from government, then they need to accept the law that the government provides that goes with it. Now, I fundamentally, and I think that I've fairly, in his absence, characterised his position on that, but I fundamentally disagree with him on that, because that money, for starters, isn't the government's, it's the taxpayers of Western Australia, which includes every parent who sends their children to a faith-based school. The second point is that, with the greatest of respect to my political opponent, he fundamentally misunderstands the role of government here. It's the right of parents to be able to educate their children, and it's the role of government to facilitate that. Now, if that means that a parent wants to do homeschooling, if a parent wants to send their child to a faith-based school, or if the parents want to send their child to the local public school, that's their choice. And the role of the government is to facilitate those options and those choices, not to control the outcome.
Thanks, Rel. I just want to add something. There's a myth out there that's perpetuated that independent schools are receiving, you know, extraordinary sums of money. The reality is, the truth of it is that it actually saves the taxpayer money for every student that goes to an independent non-government school. The reality is it's about half the amount of money that goes to funding a student through the primary school down the road compared to the school here. And it's the parents that are picking up the cost through their fees in that difference. And so it's an absolute myth and a misnomer that's put out there by opponents of non-government schools, and it really needs to be called out.
Right, thank you. Anglicare's mobile community pantries have reported 25% increase in demand, with Finneys and the Salvos reporting similar statistics. What specific policies do you propose to ease the cost of living for vulnerable families?
Thanks, Laurel. What I'd encourage members here this evening to do, if you get the opportunity, is just to look up a website, libbymedham.com.au. And so you can just Google Libby's name and it'll quickly come up. Now, on that website, Libby's got all of our policies announced, and there's a tab there specifically with respect to cost of living. And when you go on that tab, I think that you will be, well, I hope that you'll be pleasantly surprised by the sheer quantity of policies that are listed there under cost of living. There is the equivalent of $1 billion of targeted support on cost of living that is set there. libbymedham.com.au is where you want to look. Now, as an indicator of what some of those policies are, Libby's been very, very clear that what she wants to see in terms of providing support, in terms of cost of living, is structural support, as distinct from the approach that's being taken by our political opponents, which is what might be described as handouts. So what are those kind of structural supports that might be provided for cost of living? But at business level, it includes things like payroll tax, where the threshold is to be increased under a Meta Liberal government. When it comes to home ownership, we're looking at stamp duty, particularly with respect to first home owners, but also for people who are looking to downsize. Part of the issue in Western Australia at the moment is there's a housing shortage, and there are no doubt many people like my wife and I who are now empty nesters who find themselves with a house which is realistically probably too big for our needs and unnecessary. But there's a major impediment or a disincentive to be downsizing when you know you're going to be hit with a large stamp duty bill. And so Libby has got a range of policies like that, as I say, which focus on targeted structural support rather than necessarily handouts.
Payroll tax has been such an ongoing issue, so I really hope that it's something that we can remove, because I feel like, yeah, we've been talking about this for decades. Of course, with AC, there is a bit of a point of difference in, yes, it's good to have those structural policies, but I remember last election, we were actually talking about wraparound services for families. So my church, for example, we have a storehouse every Friday, and it just gives us the opportunity not only to give families some food packs, but just to go, hey, how are you going? What's happening? You know, is there anything we can do to support you? And yes, cost of living pressures are massive, but mental health issues are so proportionate as well. So I guess our point of difference is the fact that cost of living measures absolutely are important, but even those wraparound services that support families are just as crucial. So last election, one of the things we were saying is, look, it would be so beneficial to not only have Medicare counselling sessions for individuals, but actually extend those sessions so that families can access financial literacy workshops. If they're going through a tough spell, how can we actually support a family and navigate them through that? So whilst cost of living is, everybody's feeling the pinch, and we're hearing that from families at church on Fridays, they're equally going, look, not only am I trying to cope, but I'm trying to cope emotionally, I'm trying to cope psychologically. So those wraparound services, when we're talking about cost of living, actually become equally important to make sure people are coming out the other side healthy. That's really, really important for us.
Well, we probably don't have enough time tonight to go through everything, but this election will be, without doubt, federally, and you're seeing it play out at the state level, all about cost of living, because it is affecting Australians acutely. Everyone is feeling the pain of it. In Western Australia, the average income earner is $60 a week short. $60 a week short. That's for the average, let alone people that are below that average. And it's extraordinarily difficult. I commend the work of Vinnie's and the Salvos and all the other charities that are out there. And I've been engaged with them for quite some time, and they tell us that their demand for their services is increasing. It's increased to levels that they really can't cope with. Now, specific things that we've committed to doing already, and there'll be more to say over the course of the campaign, is around energy. The cost of energy has gone up significantly by pursuing radical policies around renewables, renewable-only policy that is driving up the costs of your electricity and energy bills. It's not to say we're abandoning renewables, we just believe there needs to be a mix. And so we'll transition. We've made an announcement around nuclear, which I'm personally quite excited about. But that's over the longer term. The short-term fix there is that we're not going to prematurely close down coal-fired power stations ahead of their end of life. We're going to get gas into, increase the supply of gas into the mix so that we can keep the lights on without it costing so much. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around housing. The cost of housing is astronomical. We're very grateful for the Reserve Bank decision today to reduce interest rates by 0.25% for a person on a $500,000 mortgage. That's about $75 a month. But the reality is the cost of a $500,000 mortgage has gone up over $1,200 a month since 2022. And so we've got to put downward pressure through a number of ways. We've got to increase the supply of housing. That's why we've made announcements around providing support to local governments for the greenfield development of sites so that we can actually get more land released, get more developments happening so that we can actually increase the supply. And we also, in terms of, we've got to address the issues around inflation. One of the big things driving inflation, as was pointed out by the Reserve Bank Governor today, if you took time to listen to her speech, is the impact of government spending. And government spending, putting billions and billions of dollars into the economy, has meant that we've seen inflation can persist longer than anywhere else across the world. And so reducing that, controlling our spending as a country from the government is going to see us get back on the right track in terms of inflation and keep that down so that interest rates can be reduced. So the Reserve Bank, they've said today that this is it, this one cut that we got, that is not likely to be another one before the election, and they're going to wait and see because there is a risk that it could actually spur on inflation. So we want to create the right economic settings to make sure that inflation can be kept under control and get it down to a sustainable level so that those interest rates can drop to a more normal level.
Thank you. The last of our preset questions. Research shows that children as young as 14 are being targeted on their social media feeds by gambling companies to download gambling apps, and that major sporting events are saturated with gambling ads. Most advertising legislation is the responsibility of the federal government. However, state government have control over advertising on public transport that children and families use daily. Victoria and New South Wales have already banned gambling advertising on all public transport. Do you support banning gambling advertising during sporting events and on public transport?
I'll make this one quick. We've already announced that we do. Peter Dutton has been quite strong on this. He's presented it in his last budget reply speech saying that this is what we'll do. I fully support it. I think it's terrible, and I think it's creating a culture that we don't want to see. And I'll leave the state matters to my colleagues.
Thanks, Matt. That's just a very encouraging commitment from Peter Dutton and the federal team. At a state level, I absolutely acknowledge that there is a concern with respect to gambling and its influence, the advertising, the influence on young people. But if I can take a moment to be quite personal now, there's a bigger concern in Western Australia, and I would say across the nation, when it comes to influencing children and young people. In my first term in Parliament, this is now at the end of my fourth term in Parliament, I was on the committee that oversees the Commissioner for Children and Young People. We finally, towards the end of that first term, managed to get the then Commissioner to do an inquiry into the sexualisation of children in Western Australia. And so that's more than 10 years ago now that a report was produced. Now, I would put it to members in the audience that the situation has absolutely not improved over the last decade, and that the real danger, the greater danger for children and young people at the moment is the absolute bombardment of hypersexualised imagery. And this is something that I think should be a greater priority. I'd like very much to see a parliamentary committee to reinvigorate that work, which has largely been shelved for more than a decade. Certainly, I'm personally committed to seeing something like that happen next term in Parliament.
Yep, absolutely. Short and sweet. Similar to Nick, I did a fair bit of community development work in regional and remote areas. And it's funny when Nick mentions that, because one of my things that I often saw was, again, this hypersexualised imagery and advertising as well. So gambling is absolutely a no-brainer. I mean, stats now show that actually young women are now on par as far as stats go with men. So, you know, they used to be the outliers, but whole families are now affected because people, when they're surveying them, have said their first introduction was at sporting events or through their phones. So something to be very mindful of. And of course, we support banning both of those.
Wonderful. Thank you for your very thoughtful responses to all of those questions. It's been appreciated. I'm now going to invite my colleague, Dr. Brendan Long, to the stage. Brendan has been managing the Slido app. I'm hoping that people in the audience have been able to submit questions. If, however, you don't have a mobile phone, there will be opportunity. You can raise your hand and Brendan will facilitate those questions as well.
Thank you, Narelle, and can I just reiterate on behalf of Christian Schools Australia how proud we are to be able to run an event like this, Stephen, at your school, and we thank you very much for the support that you provided for us. It's good news is the Slido app's working. We had a disaster last night. We just couldn't get it working. So, but we have got just 2 questions on the Slido app, and I'm going to read them out and assist our politicians behind us to answer them a little. And well, what I'll do is I'll just invite someone to respond first. But after that, there looks like there will be some time because we've got until 9 o'clock to ask other questions from the floor. So I'll just read the questions out. I have one anonymous question, and this is, I think, spurred by one of our questions, and that is, the question is, what has the Labor Party proposed regarding the Equal Opportunities Act? Now, that's WA law, so I'm going to invite Nick Goring to respond.
Thanks, Brendan. Well, this is on the public record, and so again, you know, I'm cautious of the privilege of being able to respond to a question in the absence of my political parliamentary colleague, but it's on the public record. Very, very clearly, the current Attorney General, Mr. Quigley, has said that they are busy drafting legislation. So this is no mere possibility. You know, they're not subject to some form of still consultation process. It's on the public record that they're busy literally penning the legislation, you know, as we sit here this evening. And the proposal is, inverted commas, this is the language that they use, to reform and to reduce the existing exemptions that apply for faith-based schools. So in terms of what the actual wording of the proposal will be, we haven't seen that. So that's being done behind closed doors. But I would just reiterate what I said earlier. There shouldn't be any change. There isn't a problem in Western Australian schools. You're a parent, you should be entitled to be able to send your child to a school that employs people who share the same values as you do, who lives out the same lifestyle that you do. And those who don't want to do that, that's fine. You don't have to go to that school. And those who don't want to work in that environment, that's fine. There's plenty of other places to work.
I think Nick's answered that, unless any of the colleagues here wish to add to it. There is one other question. We've got another one too, actually. So we've got 2 other ones. So yeah, this is from Trevor, and I'll just read the question out. We've seen actions to roll back affirmation-focused gender transition therapy in many countries. What is your understanding and position on this question? I'm going to invite all the candidates to respond, but yeah, Matt, if you want to lead the charge.
Well, we had last week in the Senate, we actually had a vote on this, something similar to this. It was a motion to have an inquiry into the prevalence of and the use of gender transition therapies, you know, particularly amongst children across Australia, and we had a conscience vote on it. I'm proud to say I voted for that. I think we should have an inquiry into this matter. I think it's absolutely criminal. If a child is not even old enough to drive a car or vote, then I don't think they're not in a right frame of mind to be making decisions about the long-term future of their, for their own bodies. And we've got situations where parents are being coerced through the zeitgeist, if you like, and they're told. I've heard this directly from parents who supported children through gender transition because they were told that if they didn't, their child would commit suicide. And then now, there's, they're seeing the negative consequences, 5-10 years later. And so, unfortunately, that motion didn't pass. The Labor Party voted unanimously together to defeat that, along with the Greens. But given it was a conscience vote, I think there was 4 in the Liberal Party that voted with them, and that's their choice. But the majority of us, including the Nationals, voted along with Pauline Hanson and other crossbenchers to support it. But sadly, it didn't get up, so we weren't able to shed some light and have some transparency over this issue.
I think the big thing is to take note not only of the CAS review that came out, but also the findings of WPATH. So this is a finding that we've pretty much been speaking about this for years now, but last year a big report came out to say, look, this is actually experimental medicine. There is no reason that we should be sending any young people, any child, any minor to not only through gender procedures, but also medication. So for us, one of the big things is actually to call for a full inquiry to see what happens at Perth Children's Clinic, but also to ban puberty blockers and procedures for pretty much anybody under the age of 18. And that's really consistent with the CAS review, really consistent with the findings that are coming out now. And something that, again, has been so concerning, like been the lone wolf in this, sort of spruiking this for many, many years now. So good to finally see a bit more action on it as well.
I can be brief on this because Libby Madden, the Liberal leader, has really been leading the charge in this respect, and she's got a public policy to say that the use of puberty blockers will be banned if she becomes the Premier of Western Australia. And again, if you want further information about that, I'd encourage you just to look at that website that I was referring to there, and I've got the full details of the policy. But she's made that very clear for quite a number of months. I think she first announced that in around about September, October last year.
Thank you for the clear responses there. Okay, I have a question from Brett, and I'll just read it out. Okay, how would a federal and state Liberal government respond to late-term abortion conversations from advocates such as Dr. Joanna Howe? So just for the benefit of the audience, Dr. Joanna Howe is an Adelaide-based advocate in the pro-life space, but I'll just really repeat the question, and it really is, how would a federal and state Liberal government, or I'm also going to extend that to invite Marika's response as well, respond to calls to end late-term abortions?
It's always a distressing topic to discuss. It's a debate that we had in the Parliament in Western Australia in this current term. I've been in there for almost 16 years, and in all of the debates that we've been involved in, and boy, we've been through some debates. This was the most difficult. This was the most, I would even say, traumatic debate to be involved in. And the reason I say that is because, and I should state at the outset that the official position of the Parliamentary Liberal Party has been, always will be, that each individual member has a conscience vote in respect to any of these life matters. And that will continue into the next parliament if any proposals are put forward. But the reason that I say that it was particularly distressing and disturbing, I'm speaking at a personal level, is because this particular legislation that was put forward by the government, and I appreciate that in Western Australia and around the world that there are strong feelings about this topic. I acknowledge and accept that that is the world in which we're living in, that people have strong feelings about this. What I simply cannot accept is a proposal or a portion in the bill which says that if a baby is born alive, subsequently dies, in other words, is left to die, and we know this happens because there's even been evidence in a Queensland inquiry in Parliament about that, and there's been answers in Parliament in Western Australia for years about this. If a baby is born alive, subsequently dies, Western Australia is now the only jurisdiction in our nation, the only one, where the coroner's jurisdiction has been removed. The coroner is prohibited by force of law from being able to investigate that particular death. And I just find that a repugnant thing. As I say, it was deeply distressing to have to deal with that legislation, but that's where we're at the moment in Western Australia.
And look, yes, I commend Nick for pretty much his courage so consistently on this issue. For AC, as you all know, the life issue is really crucial, not only because we are dealing with the most vulnerable, but we're also dealing with women and what that process looks like. One thing I do want to mention though, of course, our position won't change. Will never change. It's consistent across all candidates. Our party, always pro-life, pro-women and pro-baby. But I think we have to be so mindful as well. Everybody's sort of saying, oh, you know, to repeal abortion. I mean, one again, a key step that we can do is actually to get pregnancy support centres back on the WA Health Department brochures, get them back on the websites. I mean, the Labor government removed them. You know, it's terrible that we have the situation where people are just defaulting to death, having these women in these dreadful situations. So it's great for me to hear that there are so many pro-life colleagues. So I'm really trusting and hoping that come the next term of Parliament, we're really going to be able to shake some things up and there's going to be the will to do it.
Well, I'll just add to that by saying that we did have it is a state law that provides for abortions and provides for, sadly, late-term abortions. But we did actually have a motion come before the Senate late last year, brought forward by Senator from Victoria, Ralph Babet, and I was proud to speak in support of that motion. You can look on my Facebook page to see what I had to say about that. And I also want to and voted for it, of course. But also want to commend Nick for the very valiant efforts that he's put in over a very long time in relation to this matter. I just cannot for the life of me understand how anyone can possibly think that it's okay to not provide the care and the support, particularly for a baby born alive following a failed abortion. But once, particularly in those late terms, I just can't, in my conscience, understand how it is, but I respect the fact that, that there are differing views on this matter, and that's why the Liberal Party does have a conscience vote on these matters. But as I said, it is primarily a state matter.
Thank you. Look, they're good responses. Look, I've got one more from Mitch, and I'll read it out. In fact, I think Christian Schools Australia will be able to assist in the answer with this, but so the question is, has the Labor Party, and I take that to be the West Australian Labor Party, had any consultation with faith-based school leaders or other parties in regards to the new legislation? So I think that is related. The new legislation, which I think you're referring to, is changes to the Equal Opportunity Act, proposed changes to the Equal Opportunity Act in WA. So if that's the case, I can invite Laurel to give our responses, which is great.
Great question, thank you. What we do here at Christian Schools Australia, we have over 41 schools in WA that we work with and over 200 nationally. We are really intentional about meeting with members of parliament and candidates and senators as much as we can. Every year, around July, we meet with the Minister for Education. So that was July last year, 2024. That meeting composed of a short meeting where there was five, it was limited by the Minister of Education. 5 people were invited to attend that, and this was one of the topics that we did discuss. Then we had a second meeting that was opened up to 20 of our principals across our member schools who came along, and they were able to submit questions on a varying topics that they felt were important. So yes, we do that every year. He did give us a response. The responses were always recorded and sent to the college principals. So if you would like to talk to your college principal to get further information about the response at that time, you can do so. Thank you.
I think everyone likes using Slido, which is good. And this is working for us. Anyway, this is, I think you'll like this question, guys. So thank you, Devon. Do parties have a strategy to control the unelected government departments driving policy, similar to the US government is doing to undermine the deep state?
Well, so Jacinta Nampijin-Price, Senator for Northern Territory, she's been commissioned by Peter Dutton. She's been given an additional portfolio to her Indigenous Affairs portfolio to look at this very issue. And it's a lot of people have made a parallel with what Elon Musk is doing, Doge, as it's called in the US. It's not quite the same. We don't have, the Prime Minister doesn't have executive powers like the President does in the same way. But it is something that we will certainly be looking at in government is ways that we can get greater efficiencies through the bureaucracy. 36,000 new public servants have been hired in the last 2.5 years. That is driving up the cost of government, which ultimately is driving up the cost of living because it's having an inflationary impact. And you've got to ask yourself the question: with all those extra new public servants, is your life better? Are our schools run better? Are our hospitals run better? Well, clearly not. And so that is going to be a really high priority in a future government if we win.
Thank you for the Slido questions. Now we've just got time for a couple of questions from the floor. So if someone would like to bring forward a question, feel free.
Yeah, I'll ask questions. I believe the state Labor Party has made some noise of late about potentially cutting private rehab. It may be a bit off topic tonight, I'm not sure, but cutting private rehab centres. I know PLJ out at Shillong House has been quite vocal over socials and whatnot. Is there any logic? I mean, I don't understand the logic to that, but any response from the politicians?
Yeah, so look, it's again in keeping with this. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I'm yelling. Sorry. Takes time. Look, again, in keeping with Labor's consistent policy that everything Christian, everything faith-based almost needs to be, removed from public discourse. And it's the same thing with Peter. So faith-based rehab, because there is an element of that with Peter Lyndon James, red flags go up. So again, it's this limitation of not looking at the results, but actually looking at, well, hang on, this guy's talking about something faith-based, even though it's not, pushed on him. But it is really troubling because it comes back to the conversion legislation language that, oh, you're converting, or if you're praying for someone, that's seen as conversion practices. Yeah. So remember how I said earlier, subtle changes in legislation, changes consequent legislation. So just, again, worth the support, put Labor last, put Greens last. Yep. Just red like wildfire. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just please forgive me if I be overtly political at this time in response to that question, because the individual that has been pushing that agenda and made that announcement is the current Western Australian Health Minister. And I would say that there is an obsession by that individual, that politician, with respect to anything Christian. I think that there is a political obsession. I feel somewhat qualified to say that because I have observed this individual in both Houses of Parliament. This is an individual that was also serving in Western Australia's upper house for a short period of time before then moving to the lower house. And I reiterate, this is the Health Minister for Western Australia. And this is where I would be slightly overtly political. Instead of being concerned about those type of priorities, I think that the ordinary Western Australian would really appreciate it if the Health Minister would focus on the primary job of being the Health Minister. And when this particular administration came to power, one of the big issues that they had identified was a thing called ambulance ramping. Ambulance ramping is sadly where a person is literally stuck at the back of an ambulance. They can't get out of the ambulance and into the hospital because there's a blockage in the system, a bed blockage. At that particular time, this is nearly 8 years ago, the level of ambulance ramping in Western Australia was in the order of about 1,000 hours per month. And that was described by the then opposition as a crisis. In the month of January that's just concluded, ambulance ramping in Western Australia is 5,300 hours. So it's no exaggeration to say that the current administration have made it 5 times worse. What I would say in respect to the current health minister would be really good to be focused on that and getting a grip on that rather than essentially politically terrorising faith-based organisations.
Okay, I think, is there one more burning question from the floor? I mean, if not, oh yeah, there is, good.
Quick question for Matt, Senator Matt Sullivan. Should tax deductions be allowed for contributions or payments towards tuition fees for private schools?
Tax deductibility for school fees.
I'm now Assistant Shadow Minister, so I've got to be a little more careful how I answer these sort of questions because I'm a bit more bound. But I'll tell you, look, that's not presently the law, and there is no proposal to change it. I will take the liberty, though, of saying that we, in extending your question to say that the coalition will always defend the ability for faith-based schools to have DGR status or capital expenditure, buildings and the like. And that is something that has actually been recommended would be removed by the Productivity Commission. This was again a body of work that was requested by the Treasurer to have a look at, and they've come back and recommended that schools be removed that DGR status. So that's separate to fees, of course, but so the coalition rejected that straight away. Thankfully, Senator Henderson, the Shadow Education Minister, rejected it, and I think Peter Dunn's had something to say about it as well. But so far, the government have not. They haven't rejected that recommendation.
Okay, I'm, I've got a PhD, so it falls to me to sometimes ask a difficult, penetrating question of detail. You ready? Did you attend the Kylie Minogue concert recently? And if not, why not? That's right. thanks for the point of detail. I'll just hand it over to.
Myself neither. Well, thank you for attending. We do really appreciate your time this evening, and we appreciate your contribution with your questions and your willingness to listen and engage. We hope that that was useful for you. Over the next few days, we will put snippets of tonight's event on the My Christian Schools website. We have other events coming up, as you can see on the screen. So if you know of family, friends or church members or other people who may be interested in attending any of our upcoming events, please send them to the website where they can get further details. And can you please warmly thank our panel this evening. And finally, thank you again, Stephen, and to Hillside, to the staff and who have volunteered their time and made their beautiful building available to us. We appreciate your hospitality very much. God bless.